why so many young people are drawn to libertarianism. Their new logo is just so sick.
There's literally nothing new about that logo. It's been around for years.
Small government or minimizing government intervention does sound good on its face. It sounds great in theory, but it doesn't work in practice.
It's cute that socialists are just repeating what they're told back to every other political ideology at this point. Like, do y'all have any original thoughts, or are you just going to keep projecting your own failures onto everybody else?
Libertarian theory is actually fundamentally flawed because they see the government as controlling the big banks and corporations rather than the other way around.
That is not what libertarians believe at all. Libertarians believe that both the government and these major corporations are in bed together and do what they have to keep each other in power. And you're about to prove it with your next statement without even realizing it.
Our government is nothing but a tool of the private sector, the shareholders and the moneyed interests who control politicians through lobbying and campaign donations. And the libertarians look at this situation and say the problem is the government itself.
If the corporations legitimately had that much more power than the government, why bother with the government at all? Why not just overthrow and replace the government with what they want? The reality is, corporations need the aid of the government to maintain their power through things like subsidies, welfare, and bailouts whenever they screw up. And correct me if I'm wrong, but this type of state wealth redistribution would be a product of socialism, not capitalism. Last I checked, private companies aren't constantly giving each other welfare and bailouts whenever they need it.
Tomorrow, the private corporations would just make their own institutions. They would make their own private military.
So why don't they go ahead and do it? After all, the government is just a tool that corporations use to control people. I mean, what's stopping them from privatizing the US military itself, for that matter? The reason corporations don't do this already is because the government is too powerful and they don't have that level of control over the state. Which is why it's completely inaccurate to say that the government is the tool of the corporations when it is really the partner of the corporations. They're in bed together. A good example of this, if we're going based on your privatized military, is the Battle of Blair Mountain. The Battle of Blair Mountain was fought between mercenaries hired by the coal mining companies and unionized workers. And before any socialists say anything, stop typing. At this point in history, unions were voluntary and privately run. Contrary to what y'all need to believe, libertarians are not anti-union. We just want the unions to be privatized and voluntary, instead of the way most unions are today, which is monopolized, frequently state-run, and often mandatory. Anyway, I digress, because the mercenaries that the coal mining companies hired got their ass kicked. We have seen what happens when workers are pushed far enough to take up arms against hired mercenaries. They often do a very good job of protecting themselves, until the government gets involved. Eventually, the governor of West Virginia would send the National Guard in to put down the coal miners, ending the Battle of Blair Mountain. The bottom line is that private mercenaries usually don't do all that well against worker uprisings compared to the government.
Complete abolition of government is a utopian and not realistic solution to our problem.
Communism is also supposed to be a stateless society. Do you even know your own ideology?
Real solution is the seizure of government power from the corporations by the working class.
Let's get one thing clear. Marxists don't care about workers. I know your entire political ideology is centered around workers' rights, but in practice, y'all don't give a crap about workers. Look at how y'all have been talking about working people the last couple months because they came out in droves to support Donald Trump. For the last 2 months, leftists have done nothing but criticize, belittle, and insult workers because they didn't vote the way you think they should. You see, actions speak louder than words, and while communists and socialists will sit here on the internet saying they want workers to control the means of production, what they really want is to control workers because they are the means of production. It's never been about the workers and has always been about the control. When workers vote against socialism, they're not voting against their own self-interest. They're voting against your lust for power. You're not seizing government power for the working class. You're seizing power because you want power.
Economic system. You have to move the means of production and land economic power into the hands of the workers.
None of which actually requires socialism or communism. You can literally do that in the free market. In fact, the reason these corporations have so much power, as mentioned before, is because of the lack of a free market. Why should farmers have to pay property tax? In fact, why should anybody have to pay property tax if they've already bought it? And if the government wasn't this big, overreaching entity, who's going to bail out all these corporations when they go bankrupt? Who's going to give all these corporations subsidies and welfare and overregulate the market to the point that mom and pop can't compete? The bottom line, most of these issues we have with corporations is because the government keeps propping them up at taxpayer expense. There has never been an instance in history where the government was needed in order for working people to earn a livable wage, purchase their own land, and live on it peacefully.